Question asks, democracy remains the only genuine legitimate system of government, or indeed democracy itself is not possible, since power is the preserve of the few. When considering democracy as a system of government, it was Churchill who remarked that it was the worst system of government except for all the rest. In summary, democracy is flawed, but when compared with non-democratic forms, it was preferable. Churchill also lived a life in ideological opposition and conflict to totalitarian regimes, such as Nazi Germany and Communist Russia, where democracy was disowned or where one of the consequences was huge unchecked state power that saw historical levels of human rights abuses. This answer will consider some of the characteristics of democracy and gauge the level of legitimacy that can be attached to these and indeed the viability of democracy. In contrast, the one-party states and totalitarian regimes, which ironically regularly describe themselves as democratic, such as North Korea, are not legitimate regimes, since so much power is in the hands clearly of the few, and dissent is not only not tolerated but actually punished severely, and all built around the cult of personality of the leader, as was noted in the celebration of the founder of the state, Kim Il-sung, in recent days. This essay will consider the credentials of liberal democracies as legitimate and indeed viable, as opposed to considering some other systems of regime as legitimate or viable. For those answering this question from a pluralist perspective, it is impossible to separate democracy from liberal democracy, and together concur that such regimes are legitimate and in line with the question that the only really legitimate system of government is that of liberal democracy. And not only that, that liberal democracy itself has proved viable, and that power is not concentrated in the hands of the few. The characteristics that pluralists highlight are the presence of open and competitive elections, a diverse number of interest groups, an independent legal system, and a critical media. Since many of these things were missing, say, in pre-1989 Eastern Europe, and the communist states that operated there, and the movements that fought for the demolition of the one-party states in the likes of, say, East Germany, it is hard to argue that the emergence of democracy was not only legitimate, but a vast improvement for the lives of ordinary people, and proof positive that power is not always in the hands of the few, and in democracies, power is spread. The Economist magazine compiles an index of democratic states, and as part of its methodology, it apes the liberal democratic themes of free and fair national elections, the security of voters, freedom of civil servants to implement policies, and the lack of interference by foreign governments. Not surprisingly, the countries scoring closest to full democracy are the likes of Sweden, Norway and New Zealand. A category of flawed democracies includes India and Argentina. This index is sometimes criticised because it is commissioned by corporations who have a vested interest in portraying democracy as systems to be aspired towards, and covers up the reality that they are also some of the freest market economies that allow the maximum amount of profit making, and thus arguably leave power in the hands of the relatively few. Another measure of legitimacy of democracy is the Freedom House organisation. It categorises the legitimacy of democracy based upon the following indices: a competitive, multi-party political system, universal adult suffrage for all citizens, regularly contested elections conducted in conditions of ballot secrecy, reasonable ballot security, and in the absence of massive voter fraud that yields results that are unrepresentative of the public will, significant public access of major political parties to the electorate through the media and through generally open political campaigning. These indices echo the pluralists, and according to this, countries like the UK and the USA are free, while countries like contemporary Russia and China are unfree, and as such, democracy does operate within a certain limited number of countries. Freedom House is generally respected as a human rights non-governmental organisation that uses UN standards of measuring democracies, but even it is not beyond criticism. Chomsky argues that it is pro-United States, and recently has been involved in promoting government criticisms in Iran, and in the 1980s it openly backed a right-wing party involved in the slaughter of peasants in Ecuador. This raises the fundamental problem in this question, as viewed by its critics. Writing in a liberal democracy, it is difficult to challenge the components of political democracy. The view that is most openly expressed is not so much one of suggesting that democracy and legitimacy are not linked, but to argue that some regimes are simply more successful at implementing democracy, and therefore some regimes do actually spread power to the many, while some regimes claiming to be democracy don't spread power beyond that of the few. This relativism revolves around a number of issues. Firstly, the reality of the representative nature of modern democracies. Many might hail the election of Obama in 2008, but in reality he won only 52% of a 55% electoral turnout. The falling electoral turnout in many democracies is seen as a flaw in the system, and whilst perhaps not enough to damage their legitimacy or raise questions about the viability of democracy, it is still a matter of concern where an educated electorate refuses to exercise their franchise. Recent debate in the UK has raised the issue of including a none of the above option on the ballot paper to allow disenchanted voters to register their concern. Another measure seriously being considered in liberal democracies is the implementation of compulsory voting. However, as critics like Peter Oborne point out, it is itself a criticism of the state of liberal democracy when the state is advocating compulsion of its voters' behaviour. When asked to define a democracy, a vox populi would reference majority rule as a key feature. When this was applied in Northern Ireland from its formation, the sectarian nature of voting meant that under first past the post that unionists would win every election. It is used to be said that when the union was questioned, that James Craig would read the newsletter editorial and call an election as a referendum of the wishes of the Protestant majority. Clearly the 50 years of unionist rule raised serious questions about legitimacy. And it was not so much an elite determining the exercise of power in this situation, but an elite in religious and identity terms, effectively determining who gets what, when and how against a minority. In the job market and the allocation of public services such as housing, this form of democracy was clearly illegitimate. Indeed, it was arguably the tyranny of the majority that sparked the civil rights movement and the intransigence of the democratic majority that sparked off 30 years of civil war. A more optimistic view would be to say that not all forms of democracies fit all the democratic mechanisms, and that the democratic mechanisms, say, built into the Good Friday Agreement, such as weighted majorities, D'Hondt, STV and parallel voting, have helped to legitimise the state. Even here, critics will say that it is not a legitimate democracy when over 100 of the 108 MLAs are in a party that is in government. To them it seems also a reward to sectarian voting and effectively legitimises tribal politics. However, the more optimistic would argue the legitimacy of the system is secured by the evidence of the way that even parties like Sinn Féin and the DUP could negotiate the devolution of policing and justice. Critics come back again and describe the executive as risk-averse and dysfunctional and unable to develop consensus in key areas such as education and the economy. At a recent PSA conference in Belfast, Speaker of the House of Commons John Bercow addressed the topic of a 21st century Parliament, and within his lecture considered the extent to which Parliament and the Commons in particular was vital to democracy. His definition of democracy is the classical pluralist form of a representative assembly where the electorate are largely passive, save for every 4 or 5 years, when they decide to keep the bums or throw the bums out. He felt that democracy in the UK was in danger if it did no more than this. He was optimistic about how evolved democracies, and devolved democracies in Britain, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland had come some way to remove the sense that elites stitched up the process and that power was exercised by the clever and knowing few to the exclusion of the many. He felt that this was indeed dangerous, as low electoral turnout had shown, and even the result of the Bradford West by-election victory of George Galloway had highlighted that comfy elites cannot take power for granted. Elitists might consider the various ways that Bercow was offering improved transparency in Parliament, greater scrutiny by select committees, as over the phone hacking controversy, and the way he was, as Speaker now, encouraged ministers to respond to urgent questions and made debates more topical, was all part of a smokescreen to cover up the inadequacies of the UK model. Marxists would equally be disdainful of Bercow's call for a more engaged and dynamic democracy, with greater use of referenda and opinion polls, more transparency in the form of outreach programmes like the new Parliamentary Education Service, and his personal visits to meet with young people as all part of the institutional tinkering that fundamentally fails to address the systemic inequalities in the UK society brought about by capitalist mode of production. Berkouwer would certainly see democracy as potentially in danger of allowing elites to dominate, but his view was that within these ruling elites there was an active desire to make public politics more transparent and relevant that was essential to genuine democracy, and there was always a danger that Parliament would become a museum and politicians its curators. In other words, democracies like those of the UK may not be perfect, but are sensitive to public opinion of the type expressed in the much greater variety of protest movements, and is also aware of the social media, Facebook and Twitter, and the role that they are playing in part in empowering many more people beyond the usual suspects of intellectuals, the wealthy, the well-informed and the socially advantaged. Marxists would argue that this apparent transparency seen in so-called satirical shows like 10 O'Clock Alive is again a sham, and at best pokes fun at the powerful, pours ridicule on the odd politician or official, but leaves the status quo largely in place. Another contribution to the argument has come from political scientists like the late Samuel Huntington and his so-called gap hypothesis. He argued in the 1960s that certain states were not ready for the liberal institutions that we associate with democracy. And the main thesis was that the violence and instability characteristic of post-World War II era was in large part the product of rapid social change and the rapid mobilisation of new groups into politics, coupled with a slow development of political institutions. And the primary problem of politics is a lag in the development of the political institutions behind social and economic changes. He focused on countries such as Brazil, which had been run by the military, and when civilian governments did take power, they were fragmented and weak and often replaced by the politics of the gun. Even today in some former Central Asian and former communist states like Kyrgyzstan, there is a view that violence and instability becomes endemic in society, where democratic institutions have not had the chance to be nurtured, and that elites ultimately will take control, often in the form of the military or the wealthy. Controversially, Huntington argued that democracy was only possible where it matched with the dominant culture, and therefore its legitimacy did not depend upon such things as ideology or economic development. That said, his big point was an economic one, and referred to as the gap hypothesis. Non-democracies, or states not suited to democracy, had either a weak or very small middle class, and it was only when they grew and became involved in democracy that a democratic state would emerge. This meant that power was exercised either by a repressive elite, such as Burma's generals, or a traditional elite from Saudi Arabia, and the masses would be swayed by a mixture of nationalism or fear. For him, it was not so much a case of democracy being legitimate, but the view that it was inappropriate and in cases where it was imposed, likely to lead to violence. He saw cultural power based around language and religion as a legitimizer of the state, and determined whether or not democracy was viable. He was particularly critical of US and foreign policy that claimed to support democracies, but basically backed any regime that would trade with it on favourable terms. The issue of relativism continues over the use or non-use of direct democracy. For this reason, countries like Switzerland are often held up as being more legitimate, since they don't pay their MPs and allow many key decisions to be initiated and decided by referendum. Surely this is the perfect case of elites not determining the outcome in a democracy. This is generally seen as legitimate, but even here there are notes of criticism. The Swiss did vote in favour of allowing free entry of migrant workers, and as such come across as consensual liberal. However, they also approved a ban on minarets, which could be seen as a block upon religious freedom. As with any aspects of democracy, some view legitimacy in terms of majority or majoritarian rule, the tyranny of the majority and coalition governments. This raises the issue of how democracy is set up. Advocates of US democracy as legitimate and viable point to it the way in which the Constitution encourages bipartisanship, separation of powers and checks and balances, and thus limited government. However, critics point out the same Constitution for some 150 years denied basic civil rights to black Americans, and in 2000 the electoral system arguably cheated the people out of their choice of president. Advocates of democracy which encourages coalition might look at Northern Ireland, where 5 parties currently share power. The benefits are seen as those which reward negotiation and non-violence, and as thus legitimise such deals as those of St Andrews and Hillsborough, and arguably envelop in all the minorities to make sure that democracy is effectively a form of majority rule, but all majorities rule. Critics argue that the settlement is not legitimate and actually rewards violence and brinkmanship. The executive is regarded as dysfunctional and risk-averse, and fundamental issues such as education and economy are often fudged and gridlocked. Some Marxists argue that liberal democracy is an integral part of the capitalist system and is class-based and not democratic or participatory. It is bourgeois democracy because ultimately politicians fight only for the rights of the bourgeoisie. The 2010 general election campaign, it was contended, was a fight for the votes of the middle class, and this is why issues such as social care are prominent, since they reflect the concerns of those who own property. Because of this, it is seen as fundamentally undemocratic, existing or operating in a way that facilitates economic exploitation. According to Marxists, parliamentary elections are an opportunity citizens of a country get every few years to decide who among the ruling classes will misrepresent them in Parliament. This idea of misrepresentation by the ruling classes, or ruling elite, was echoed by Pareto in Moscow. By the 80-20 rule and the circulation of elites. The cost of political campaigning in representative democracies favours the rich, a form of plutocracy, where a very small minority of the voters determine the outcome of elections. Modern democracy has also been attacked by socialists as a dishonest force used to keep the masses from realising that their will is irrelevant in the political process, while at the same time a conspiracy for making them restless for some political agenda. Some contend that it encourages candidates to make deals with wealthy supporters, offering favourable legislation if the candidate is elected, perpetuating conspiracies for monopolisation of key areas. And as such, we hear often in America of the politics of the pork barrel. Campaign finance reform is an attempt to correct this perceived problem. In response to these claims, United States economist Stephen Levitt argues in his book Freakonomics that campaign spending is no guarantee of electoral success. He compared electoral success to the same pair of candidates running against one another repeatedly for the same job, as often happens in the United States congressional elections, where spending levels varied. This view was also expressed by those who welcomed the millions of small contributions made via the internet to the Obama campaign in 2008. Levitt concluded, a winning candidate can cut his spending in half and lose only 1% of the vote. Meanwhile, a losing candidate who doubles his spending can expect to shift the vote in his favour by only that same 1%. This arguably suggesting that democracy is viable, and although elites try to interfere with the political system, their success is often exaggerated. Critics of the role of the media in liberal democracies allege that concentration of media ownership leads to major distortions of the democratic process. They often cite the way that Fox News and the media empire, the likes of Murdoch or Berlusconi in Italy and Globo in Brazil, distort the claims of legitimacy. They argue that the corporate media limits the availability of contesting views and effectively propagandise a narrow spectrum of elite opinion. This is a natural consequence, they say, of the close ties between powerful corporations and the media, and not due to any conscious conspiracy. Systemic bias shapes the content of the media outlets to correspond with corporate interests. Although freedom of speech is secured and protected by the state, such as in the First Amendment of the American Constitution, only those that adhere to that limited spectrum of opinion are granted significant and consistent access to the major media outlets. This is a big point that's made by Noam Chomsky. Media commentators also point out that the influential early champions of the media industry held fundamentally anti-democratic views, opposing the general population's involvement in creating policy. Walter Lippmann, for example, sought to put the public in its place so that those in power would be free of the trampling and roar of a bewildered herd, while Edward Bernays sought to regiment the public mind every bit as much as an army regiments their bodies. Bernays himself is often seen as the father of public relations. They also say that even though law ensures the right to free speech, the ability to spread information to large numbers of people is limited to only those who can afford it. This view is countered by those who see the social network and Twitter as essentially democratic. They highlight that it was via social media that protests sparked and mobilised the Arab Spring. They highlight the viral phenomenon of Coney 2012 as evidence of how ordinary people can be drawn into campaign and protest politics. For critics of such social media, they highlight that the social media has not really changed the power dynamic in such countries as Egypt, where the army elite still hold the levers of power, and the Coney 2012 campaign smacks of colonial interference in the affairs of Uganda by right-wing evangelical Christians. In other words, elite manipulation of the political process. Proponents claim that constitutionally protected freedom of speech makes it possible for both profit and non-profit organisations to debate the issues. They argue that media coverage in democracy simply reflects public preferences as it does not entail censorship. You can sit down on a Sunday morning and hear Nicky Campbell debate the moral and political issues of the day amongst a pluralistic audience. Especially with new forms of media such as the internet, it is not expensive to reach a wide audience if there is an interest in the ideas presented. If you were to take the spectrum of newspapers available in the UK, along with the TV networks, there's a feeling that personality dominates politics and that fundamentals of the system are never criticised. The Chancellor's debate during the 2010 election reflects the view that it is democracy in action, where critics would ask why such a narrow section of the political spectrum are given this amount of time, and why alternatives to these ideas are so marginalised. Democracy becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy for those who argue that it is legitimised by the capitalist class throwing up a smokescreen of democratic dialogue where actually microeconomic arguments about tax increases, such as reducing corporation tax or taking people earning less than £9,000 out of tax and national insurance, are secondary to the actual mode by which goods and services are produced in society. For Marxists, it is the fundamental production of goods and services and its unequal distribution in so-called democracies that leads to gross inequalities in power and makes democracy a sham. A criticism of democracy revolves around its endorsements of majorities, and as such, the so-called tyranny of the majority often makes decisions that upset minorities. This may be offset by a Bill of Rights, but if you're a gay person wishing to take recreational drugs and dip into pornography, your rights seem to be pushed to the margins. The fact that a Ricky Martin felt compelled not to reveal his homosexuality as part of this democratic smothering is endemic of such democratic values. The decision to ban methadone occurred without the consideration of how it could go underground and become an even more sought after drug and more subject to criminal use. Democracy like this, shaped by irrational fears and unbalanced argument, is hardly legitimate. The counter-view says that the government did not rush to make this decision, but did so after considering the risks and basing the decision upon the views of scientists' advice. In recent years, pluralists have been keen to highlight how democracy emerging in former Soviet-style states has witnessed a decline in ethnic conflict and interstate wars, and as such democratic mechanisms have acted to legitimise the new regimes. However, for those who witnessed the collapse of Yugoslavia, the new democracies also saw the appearance of ethnic cleansing, and as such democracy was often used by different ethnic groups to justify nationhood and persecution of a hated minority. This view of the dangers of market force-driven democracy has been articulated by Amy Chua in her book World on Fire. She argues that, quote, when free market democracy is pursued in the presence of a market-dominant minority, the almost invariable result is backlash. This backlash typically takes one of three forms. The first is a backlash against markets, targeting the market-dominant minority's wealth. The second is a backlash against democracy by forces favourable to the market-dominant minority. The third is violence, sometimes genocidal, directed against the market-dominant minority itself. In the Philippines, Chua explains the ethnic Chinese minority has far greater wealth than the indigenous majority, the result being envy and bitterness on the part of the majority against the Chinese minority, in other words, an ethnic conflict. She believes that democratisation can increase ethnic conflicts when an ethnic minority is disproportionately wealthy. When free market democracy is pursued in the presence of a market-dominant minority, the almost invariable result is backlash. Also, overnight, democracy will empower the poor indigenous majority. What happens is that under these circumstances, democracy doesn't do what we expect it to do, that is, reinforce markets. Instead, democracy leads to the emergence of manipulative politicians and demagogues who find that the best way to get votes is scapegoating the minorities. Countering this view is the observation that democratic states are legitimised because there are few examples of democratic states going to war with other democracies. This type of legitimacy is the so-called peace theory. And with the exception of possibly Ecuador and Honduras and Britain and Iceland over COD, the theory seems substantially true. Pluralists, again, make much of the way in which democracy is legitimised by its non-violent approach to conflict resolution. Some critics, such as Huntington, argue that the legitimacy of democracy, whilst not questioned, must be seen in terms of its appropriateness. The desire, for instance, to impose democratic institutions in Iraq and Afghanistan has not been a success. In Iraq, the previously dominant minority Sunni population will naturally lose out in the ballot box to the majority Shiite populace. Consequently, desires to settle old scores and a sense of being in permanent opposition has led to an escalation of violence. And perversely, of course, democracy, which is supposed to be about empowering people, can actually lead to, as it did in Northern Ireland and it has possibly in Iraq, led to a disadvantage, in this case majority, using their power of the ballot box to exercise power over the formerly powerful minority. Imposing democracy in Afghanistan has been even more unsuccessful, and the current government's legitimacy hardly stretches beyond the outskirts of Kabul. Huntington points out that historically democracy is something of a recent phenomenon, and without a settled middle class and a strong economic base, it amounts to little more than one form of mob ruler tyranny of the majority over the other. Dworkin argues that democracy is itself only legitimate when it can exercise enough power that it does not trample on the rights of minorities.